Quartermaster Moran leaned back in his chair, all four of his massive arms crossed behind his head as he watched the security feed with undisguised amusement. The 7-foot Nexari warrior's purple-scaled face twisted into what passed for a grin among his species, revealing rows of razor-sharp teeth that had torn through enemy flesh on a dozen battlefields. "Oh, by the sacred moons of Nexar," Moran wheezed, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he pointed one of his clawed fingers at the screen. "Look at this pathetic display, brothers." On the monitor, a small human female struggled with what should have been a routine task. Amy Kowalski, according to her personnel file, was attempting to move a standard cargo container from Bay 7 to Bay 12. The container, weighing maybe 200 pounds by galactic standards, might as well have been a mountain for all the progress she was making. "She's been at it for 10 minutes now," Moran continued, his voice getting louder as more crew members gathered around his station. 10 whole minutes. My youngest nephew could move that container with his eyes closed and 3 arms tied behind his back." The human girl on screen wiped sweat from her forehead, took a deep breath, and tried again. Her face turned red with effort as she managed to slide the container maybe 6 inches before having to stop and rest. "Magnificent," Moran said, clapping his upper 2 hands together in mock applause. "Truly the pinnacle of evolution right there. No wonder the humans needed our protection during the Krell Wars." Morton, a fellow Nexari sitting nearby, chuckled and shook his head. "I heard they barely passed the physical requirements for space duty. Had to lower the standards just to get them aboard." "Lower the standards?" Moran's laugh boomed across the cargo bay control room. "They didn't lower them, they completely obliterated them. I've seen newborn Nexari hatchlings with more upper body strength than that whatever she's supposed to be. The Nexari were a proud species, built for war and conquest. Every Nexari child learned from birth that physical prowess was the ultimate measure of worth. Their 4 arms weren't just for show, they were weapons, tools and symbols of their superiority over the lesser species of the galaxy. A Nexari warrior, who couldn't lift 10 times his own body weight, was considered defective. "Speaking of obliterated standards," Morton said, straightening up, "Admiral Vashi's shuttle just docked. Word is he's here for the mandatory inspection of our new human additions." Moran's expression soured. The Galactic Trade Accords had forced every major trading vessel to include human crew members as part of some ridiculous species integration initiative. As if the Nexari needed lessons in cooperation from a race that couldn't even open their own food containers without mechanical assistance. The cargo bay doors hissed open, and Admiral Vashi strode in with his usual military bearing. The Admiral was old, even by Nexari standards, with scars crisscrossing his purple hide from countless battles. His 4 arms moved in perfect synchronization as he surveyed the room. "Quartermaster Moran," Admiral Vashi's voice carried the weight of absolute authority. "Report on the integration progress." Moran stood at attention, though his eyes kept drifting back to the security feed where Amy Kowalski was still wrestling with the same cargo container. "So the humans have been adequately placed in positions matching their limited capabilities." "Limited capabilities?" Admiral Vashi raised one scaled eyebrow. "Well, sir," Moran gestured toward the screen with obvious disdain, "observe our newest junior mechanic. She's been assigned to light cargo duty, and as you can see, even that might be beyond her abilities." Admiral Vashi watched the feed for a moment, his expression unreadable. "I see. And what's your assessment of human integration overall?" "Honestly, sir." Moran's voice dropped to what he thought was a respectful whisper, though it still carried across the room. "I don't understand why the Accords even classify humans as a viable species for space work. They're weak, slow, and frankly I'm not sure they're much more evolved than the cargo containers they can't lift." Several crew members snickered at this observation. On screen, Amy had finally managed to move the container another foot before collapsing against the wall, breathing heavily. "Look at that," Moran continued, warming to his audience. "That's supposedly one of Earth's finest specimens, and she's been defeated by an inanimate object. I've heard rumors that humans are considered dangerous in combat, but honestly I think a strong breeze would knock most of them over. Admiral Vashi nodded slowly, though something in his ancient eyes suggested he wasn't entirely convinced by Moran's assessment. Carry on, Quartermaster. But remember, the Accords exist for good reason. As the Admiral left, Moran turned back to his audience with a satisfied grin. Good reason, he repeated mockingly. The only good reason I can think of is comedy relief. 3 hours later, the mess hall buzzed with the usual dinner conversation when Moran decided to continue his entertainment routine. He'd gathered quite an audience of Nexari, Korthak, and even a few Villani engineers, all eager to hear more about the amusing human additions to their crew. So there I was, Moran said, gesturing wildly with all 4 arms while balancing his meal tray, watching this Amy character try to move what we'd consider a paperweight. And I swear she looked like she was attempting to relocate a small planet. The assembled aliens erupted in laughter, their various species versions of amusement creating a cacophony that echoed off the metal walls. Moran basked in the attention, his purple scales practically glowing with pride. I mean seriously, he continued, his voice getting progressively louder and more theatrical. How did these humans even survive long enough to develop space travel? Did they evolve on a planet with gravity so weak that a feather weighed as much as a boulder? What Moran didn't notice, in his enthusiasm for his own comedy routine, was the small human figure sitting alone at a corner table, quietly eating her regulation meal. Amy Kowalski had been listening to every word, her jaw tightening with each insult. Maybe, Moran declared, standing up now and flexing his 4 arms in sequence, maybe we should start a betting pool on how long it takes her to move a single wrench from one end of the workshop to the other. That was apparently Amy's breaking point. She stood up slowly, her chair scraping against the metal floor with a sound that somehow cut through all the laughter. The mess hall gradually fell silent as the small human walked directly toward Moran's table, her steps measured and deliberate. "Excuse me," Amy said, her voice quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden silence. "Quartermaster, Moran, isn't it?" Moran turned around, surprised to find himself face to face with the subject of his jokes. Up close, she was even smaller than he'd imagined, barely reaching his chest even with his seated position. "Oh well, hello there, little human. Enjoying the meal? I hope they remembered to pre-chew it for you." More scattered chuckles from the audience, but Amy's expression didn't change. "I couldn't help but overhear your commentary about my physical capabilities." Commentary? Moran's grin widened. "Oh, that wasn't commentary. That was objective observation based on scientific evidence. Namely, watching you fail to move a cargo container for 23 minutes and 17 seconds. "I see," Amy nodded slowly. "Well, since you seem so confident in your assessment, and since physical prowess is clearly important to Nexari culture, I'd like to formally invoke the right of challenge under Section 12 of the Nexari Honor Codes." The mess hall went dead silent. Even the ventilation system seemed to pause. Moran's 4 eyes went wide. You want to challenge me to a test of strength?" "That's correct," Amy replied calmly. "Unless of course you're afraid that your scientific observations might be inaccurate." The explosion of laughter that followed was so loud that it triggered the ship's noise complaint sensors. Moran practically fell off his chair, all 4 arms clutching his sides as he wheezed with hysterical amusement. Oh, this is perfect," he gasped between laughs. "The tiny human wants to challenge the Quartermaster. What's next? Are you going to arm wrestle the ship's engines?" "Actually," Amy said, completely unfazed by his reaction, "arm wrestling sounds perfect. Best of 3 matches, standard Nexari rules." Commander Tom Marley, who had been quietly eating his dinner at the officers' table, suddenly appeared beside them. The grizzled Nexari veteran's scarred face showed deep concern. "Miss Kowalski," he said carefully, "are you absolutely certain about this? The right of challenge is binding under galactic law. Once accepted, there's no backing down." Amy nodded firmly. "I understand the consequences, Commander." Marley turned to Moran, who was still giggling. "Quartermaster, You realize you'll be held responsible if this goes badly. Responsible. Moran wiped tears from his eyes. Commander, the only thing I'll be responsible for is providing the crew with the best entertainment they've had in months. Of course I accept. Within minutes, word had spread throughout the entire ship. Crew members from every deck abandoned their duties to crowd into the mess hall's converted challenge area. The betting started immediately, with electronic credits flying between personal communicators. 10 credits on Moran in under 30 seconds. I'll take that bet, but make it 20 seconds. Anyone giving odds on the human lasting a full minute. The laughter was constant now, with aliens placing increasingly ridiculous bets on just how quickly their quartermaster would humiliate the small human. Moran, meanwhile, had stripped off his uniform jacket and was putting on quite a show. His 4 massive arms flexed in a choreographed display of muscle that had served him well in countless battles. Each arm was easily twice as thick as Amy's entire torso, with veins bulging under his purple scales, like organic cables. Ladies and gentlemen, he announced to his audience, observe the pinnacle of Nexari physical evolution. He flexed his upper right arm, then his lower left, then both right arms together. 4 arms, each capable of lifting 500 pounds, muscles forged in the gravity wells of 3 different worlds, reflexes honed by 17 years of military service. Amy, meanwhile, had found a quiet corner, where she simply stretched her shoulders and rolled her neck from side to side. No dramatic displays, no boastful announcements, just methodical preparation that somehow made several of the more observant aliens feel slightly uncomfortable. Commander Mali stepped forward to officiate. Standard arm wrestling rules. Best of 3 matches wins. First match begins in 60 seconds. May the stronger being prevail. Moran cracked his knuckles. All 16 of them. Don't worry, little human. I'll try to make this quick. The makeshift arm wrestling table, hastily constructed from 2 mess hall benches, creaked under Moran's weight as he settled into position. The crowd pressed closer, their excitement palpable as credits continued to change hands on personal communicators. Right then, Commander Mali announced, first match, Quartermaster, you may choose which arm to use. Moran made a show of considering his options, flexing each of his 4 arms in turn before settling on his upper right, his dominant limb. I think one should be sufficient, he declared loudly, earning another round of appreciative laughter from the crowd. Amy took her position across from him, both hands clasping his single massive forearm. The size difference was almost comical. Moran's arm nearly as thick as Amy's waist, his clawed fingers wrapping entirely around her smaller hands. This feels unfair, Moran said with mock concern, his voice dripping with sarcasm. Maybe I should use my weaker arm, or perhaps just my thumb. Your current setup is fine, Amy replied evenly, adjusting her grip with what looked like practiced precision. Mali raised his hand. Competitors ready. Match begins on my mark. 3, 2, 1 engage. Moran applied pressure immediately, expecting to end this farce in seconds. His massive arm tensed, veins bulging as he prepared to slam Amy's hands down to the table with overwhelming force. But something was wrong. Instead of the instant capitulation he expected, Moran felt resistance. Not much, but definitely more than he'd anticipated from what should have been a trivial opponent. Amy's hands remained steady, her arms forming a solid triangle of leverage that somehow absorbed his initial surge of power. Moran grunted, applying more pressure. You're stronger than you look, little human. The crowd was still laughing, but a few of the more experienced warriors had stopped chuckling and started watching more carefully. Amy wasn't winning, but she wasn't losing either. Her technique was flawless, her body position optimized for maximum mechanical advantage. Moran, meanwhile, was relying purely on brute strength, his arm working against itself as he tried to force the issue through raw power. Sweat began to bead on his purple forehead, as he realized this wasn't going to be the 10-second victory he'd promised. Having trouble there, Quartermaster? Someone called out from the crowd, earning nervous laughter. Just playing with my food, Moran growled, putting serious effort into his arm now. The muscles in his shoulder and back engaged, his breathing becoming more labored. Amy, by contrast, looked almost relaxed. Her breathing remained steady, her focus absolute. She was clearly losing ground, her hands slowly being forced toward the table, but the pace was nothing like what anyone had expected. After 2 full minutes of struggle, Moran finally managed to pin her hands to the table. The crowd cheered, but the enthusiasm was notably muted. 2 minutes was far longer than anyone had bet on. "Well," Moran said, trying to sound casual while catching his breath, "that was more entertaining than expected." "Indeed," Amy replied, flexing her fingers to restore circulation. "Ready for round 2. Commander Marley stepped forward again. "Second match. Quartermaster, your arm selection." Moran hesitated. His pride demanded he stick with one arm, but his practical military experience was sending warning signals. That first match had been far too close for comfort. "I think," he said slowly, "I'll use 2 arms this time. Just to make it more interesting, you understand." The crowd's reaction was mixed. Some cheered at the prospect of a more dramatic contest, while others muttered about the quartermaster's obvious concern. Moran positioned both his upper arms on the table, their combined mass making Amy's grip look even more impossibly outmatched. "There," he said, more to reassure himself than anyone else. "Now we can have a proper contest. 3, 2, 1 engage." This time Moran held nothing back. 2 arms, full strength, no playing around. He was going to crush this challenge immediately and restore his reputation. The result was not what he expected. Amy's technique had evolved. Where before she'd simply tried to match his strength, now she was actively using his own force against him. As he pushed down and forward, she redirected that energy, causing his arms to work against each other, rather than in concert. "What?" the Moran gasped as he felt his carefully coordinated push become a confused tangle of opposing forces. The crowd had gone completely silent now. Amy wasn't just resisting, she was actually gaining ground. Slowly, incrementally, but unmistakably, Moran's hands were moving away from victory and toward defeat. "This isn't possible," someone whispered from the audience. Moran's face turned a deeper shade of purple as he strained with everything he had. Both arms shaking with effort, sweat pouring down his scaled hide, he threw his entire upper body into the contest. Amy adjusted her position slightly, found a new angle of leverage, and with a sudden surge of coordinated power, slammed both of Moran's hands flat against the table. The silence was deafening. "Second match to the human," Commander Marley announced, his voice carefully neutral. The betting had stopped entirely. Crew members stared in stunned disbelief as their supposedly invincible quartermaster sat frozen, staring at his defeated hands as if they belonged to someone else. That was luck," Moran said finally, his voice hollow. "A fluke, some kind of technique trick." Amy cracked her knuckles, a sound that somehow seemed ominous in the silent mess hall. "One more match then, best of 3. Moran looked around desperately at the crowd, seeing doubt in faces that had been filled with confidence just minutes before. His reputation, his career, his entire identity as a Nexari warrior, was crumbling with each passing second. "Final match," he declared, his voice cracking slightly. 3 arms. I'll use 3 arms." The crowd stirred uneasily. Using 3 arms against a single opponent was considered excessive, even by Nexari standards. "Quartermaster," Commander Marley said quietly, "are you certain? 3 against 2 seems, I don't care how it seems." Moran snapped, positioning 3 of his 4 arms on the table in a configuration that looked more like a wrestling hold than a fair contest. "This ends now." But as he looked across the table at Amy's calm, determined face, Quartermaster Moran began to suspect that his humiliation was just beginning. The arrangement on the table looked absolutely ridiculous. 3 of Moran's massive arms formed an interlocking triangle of purple-scaled muscle, their combined mass creating what appeared to be an impenetrable wall of Nexari strength. Amy's 2 human arms looked pathetically inadequate by comparison, like twigs attempting to hold back a landslide. "This is madness," Commander Marley muttered, but he stepped back to give them room. "Final match." May the ancestors forgive us all. The crowd had pressed closer now, their earlier amusement replaced by a mixture of fascination and horror. This had gone far beyond entertainment. It had become something primal, a test of everything they thought they knew about the natural order of the galaxy. 3, 2, 1, engage. Moran unleashed everything he had. 3 arms, coordinated through years of military training, pushed with the combined force of a small industrial press. His entire upper body strained as he channeled decades of Nexari warrior conditioning into this single decisive moment. For the first 30 seconds, it looked like the contest was over. Amy's arms bent backward under the tremendous pressure, her face reddening with effort as she fought against what seemed like impossible odds. But then something remarkable began to happen. While Moran's initial surge was devastating, Amy seemed to settle into the contest like she was just getting comfortable. Her breathing remained controlled, her technique adapting to handle the triple threat assault. Most importantly, while Moran was already showing signs of strain, Amy looked like she could maintain this level of effort indefinitely. What are you?" Moran gasped, sweat now streaming down his face, as he realized his maximum effort wasn't producing the quick victory he desperately needed. "Human," Amy replied simply, her voice steady despite the tremendous forces at play. "We're persistence hunters, Quartermaster. We don't have to be the strongest to win, we just have to last longer than you can." The terrible truth of her words began to sink in as the contest continued. Moran's 3 arms, designed for short bursts of overwhelming power, were starting to shake with fatigue. His Nexari physiology, optimized for quick, decisive combat, wasn't built for extended struggles. Amy, meanwhile, had found her rhythm. Her human muscle fibers, packed with slow twitch endurance capabilities, were just reaching their optimal performance zone. "Impossible," someone whispered from the crowd. "She's actually gaining ground." It was true. Slowly, inexorably, Amy was pushing back. Moran's hands, which had been steadily forcing hers toward defeat, had stopped moving. Then incredibly, they began moving in the other direction. No, Moran snarled, throwing his 4th arm into the contest in violation of his own declared rules. 4 arms now, everything he had, in a desperate attempt to salvage victory from the jaws of unthinkable defeat. The crowd gasped at this breach of honor, but nobody moved to stop it. They were too transfixed by the impossible sight of a single human pushing back 4 Nexari arms through sheer relentless endurance. "Getting tired?" Amy asked conversationally, and the casual tone of her voice sent chills through every observer. She wasn't just winning, she was dominating. Moran's arms were trembling now, his muscles screaming in protest as they reached the limits of their design. His breathing had become ragged, desperate, while Amy looked like she could continue this contest for hours if necessary. "I am Quartermaster Moran," he roared, putting every last reserve of strength into one final, catastrophic push. It was exactly the wrong thing to do. Amy had been waiting for this moment when desperation would override technique, when brute force would become uncontrolled and vulnerable. As Moran threw everything into his attack, she redirected his energy with perfect precision, using his own tremendous strength against the structural limits of his joints. The sound that followed would haunt the nightmares of every crew member present. Crack, crack, crack. 3 distinct snaps echoed through the mess hall as Moran's upper arms broke simultaneously, their bones unable to handle the combination of his own desperate strength and Amy's expertly applied leverage. Moran's scream shattered the silence, a sound of pure agony that triggered emergency medical alerts throughout the ship. He collapsed backward, his 3 broken arms hanging at impossible angles while his 4th, mercifully intact limb, clutched uselessly at the air. Amy sat back in her chair, flexing her fingers casually. "Good match," she said politely. The medical team arrived within minutes, but the journey to the medical bay felt like hours. Moran, pumped full of painkillers and wrapped in emergency stabilization fields, drifted in and out of consciousness, while the full extent of his injuries became clear. Dr. Kethril, the ship's chief medical officer, delivered the diagnosis with clinical detachment. 3 compound fractures, multiple ligament tears, and extensive muscle damage. The breaks are clean, which is fortunate, but the healing process will take months, maybe longer. My career, Moran whispered through drug-induced haze. My warrior status. I'm afraid your combat days are over, Quartermaster, the doctor confirmed. These injuries will leave permanent weakness in all 3 limbs. As if to add insult to injury, Dr. Kethrell pulled up a holographic display showing human muscular structure. I've been researching human physiology since the challenge, he explained. Fascinating species, really. Their muscle fiber density is nearly triple what we assumed. Their endurance capabilities are off our standard charts, and their leverage mechanics, well, you experienced those firsthand. Moran stared at the display in numb horror. They're not weak. Weak? Dr. Kethrell laughed grimly. Quartermaster, pound for pound, humans might be the strongest species in the known galaxy. We just never bothered to test them properly. Through the haze of medication and despair, Moran finally understood why Admiral Vashi had seemed unsurprised by recent events, and why the Galactic Trade Accords had been so insistent on human integration. They hadn't been trying to help a weak species survive. They'd been trying to keep a dangerous one contained. 3 weeks later, Moran sat in his recovery chair, watching the security feeds with an entirely different perspective. His 3 broken arms were encased in bio-regeneration casts that hummed softly with healing energy, leaving only his lower left arm functional for basic tasks. On the screen, Amy Kowalski was effortlessly moving cargo containers that had once seemed impossibly heavy for her small frame. But now Moran understood what he was really seeing. She wasn't struggling, she was being careful. Every movement was precisely controlled, every lift calculated to avoid damaging the equipment or the ship's delicate internal systems. Incredible, isn't it? Admiral Vashi's voice came from behind him. Moran turned awkwardly in his chair, his mobility severely limited by the medical equipment. Admiral, I didn't hear you come in. I've been meaning to have this conversation with you, Quartermaster. Vashi settled into the chair beside him, his ancient eyes fixed on the security feed. Tell me, what do you see when you watch her now? I see. Moran paused, choosing his words carefully. I see someone who was holding back. Someone who could have moved those containers easily from day one, but was being considerate of our equipment tolerances. Exactly. Vashi nodded approvingly. The human integration protocols weren't designed to accommodate their limitations, Moran. They were designed to manage their capabilities. The Admiral pulled up a classified file on his personal communicator, displaying species classification data that Moran had never seen before. Humans are listed as a Class 7 persistence predator species.
Do you know what that means?
Moran shook his head, though the term sent chills down his spine. It means they're apex hunters who kill their prey through relentless pursuit rather than overwhelming force. On their home planet, they would chase animals for hours, sometimes days, until their targets collapsed from exhaustion. Then they would move in for the kill. The implications hit Moran like a physical blow. The endurance capabilities are just the beginning, Vashi confirmed. Their pain tolerance is extraordinary, their recovery time is phenomenal, and their psychological resilience is off our measurement scales. In the Krell Wars, human shock troops would continue fighting with injuries that would incapacitate most species entirely. A soft knock at the medical bay door interrupted their conversation. Amy Kowalski peered in hesitantly, carrying a small package. I'm sorry to interrupt, she said politely. I just wanted to check on your recovery, Quartermaster. The genuine concern in her voice made Moran's remaining functional hand clench involuntarily. After everything he'd said, after the public humiliation he'd directed at her, she was checking on his welfare. That's very kind of you, Miss Kowalski, he managed, his voice rough with emotion he couldn't quite identify. Amy approached carefully, setting the package on his bedside table. I brought some human reading materials about physical therapy techniques. Dr. Kethrell thought they might help with your recovery process. Admiral Vashi stood to leave but paused at the door. Miss Kowalski, I have some news. Command has approved your promotion to Chief Engineer, effective immediately. Congratulations. Amy's face lit up with genuine surprise and pleasure. Thank you, Admiral. I won't let you down. After Vashi left, an awkward silence settled over the medical bay. Moran stared at his casted arms, trying to find words for an apology that seemed impossibly inadequate. I was wrong, he said finally, about everything, about your species, about your capabilities, about you personally. I made assumptions based on ignorance and prejudice, and I'm sorry. Amy pulled up a chair and sat down beside him. We all make mistakes, Quartermaster. The important thing is learning from them. I don't understand why you're being so kind to me, Moran admitted. If our positions were reversed, I'm not sure I would be. That's the difference between us, Amy said gently. Humans don't see strength as something to use against others just because we can. We see it as something to use to protect and help others when we need to. Over the following weeks, as Moran transitioned to his new role in logistics coordination, he found himself becoming an unexpected advocate for human capabilities. When new crew members made the same ignorant assumptions he once had, Moran was quick to correct them. Let me tell you about the day I learned what humans are really capable of, he would begin, gesturing with his slowly healing arms. It's a story about strength, endurance, and what happens when you mistake kindness for weakness. The irony wasn't lost on him. Amy Kowalski, now Chief Engineer, was running the ship's most critical systems with quiet competence and innovative solutions. Meanwhile, Moran, the former warrior, had found his new calling in education and administration. Sometimes, late at night when the ship was quiet, he would watch the security feeds and marvel at how much his perspective had changed. The humans weren't the weakest species in the galaxy. They might just be the strongest, and the wisest thing the rest of them could do was learn from that strength, rather than challenge it.